Welcome to another Coffee with Samso, where we talk with ASX companies and the leaders on what they're doing in the projects. We get an insight of their thinking. Here today, we've got Taruga Minerals here with Thomas Line. He's actually over in Sydney. Thomas, thank you for giving us time. Welcome to Coffee with Samso. Maybe just give us a good intro into yourself. And Taruga has a fantastic business and a story. So let's hear about it.
My pleasure, Noel. Thanks for the introduction, and really nice to be here on this call. I really like the setting of this particular show because it gives people a chance to get a little bit more deep into the geology and an educational opportunity for investors and shareholders who don't often get into the meat of the stories, and a chance to elaborate on some of the ASX announcements. So yeah, thanks for having me. Taruga's primary focus is on copper, and we've got a large land package around Australia. Our core projects are in South Australia. I've been working with Taruga for about just over a year now. And I came in as exploration manager in May of 2020, when Taruga announced an option agreement with Strikeline Resources, which was a company that I founded and which had projects in South Australia. So Strikeline Resources had a bunch of IOCG, iron oxide copper gold style exploration projects in South Australia that I pegged in 2019. And when I met with Taruga, they were looking for a new project, core project to really relaunch in Australia. Strikeline and our IOCG projects were the projects that they chose to go forward with. So I entered into the option agreement with Taruga in May 2020, and that option was exercised in May of this year. And so Strikeline Resources has now been acquired by Taruga Minerals Limited, who now owns all of Strikeline's South Australian projects, of which there are 3. And as I said, we've also got the West Australian projects in the Manjimup district as well.
Before you go on, I guess, one of the interests that I've noticed of late is there's a lot of people talking about South Australian projects and the likes of it. And I was intrigued. I mean, what made you choose these projects in the first place?
Well, I was working in the Gawler Craton in South Australia for essentially my entire career as a geologist. And I just became fascinated with the geology and the amount of mineralization that was expressed at the surface and was recorded at the surface, but how little exploration in modern times, particularly the last 10 or 15 years, had been conducted in certain areas. I spent a lot of time reading the old reports from Dr. Haynes and O'Driscoll, who were instrumental in the discovery of Olympic Dam. And really what they did was they identified these structural corridors or lineaments. We talk about these as the G2 structural corridor. And Olympic Dam, Carrapateena, Prominent Hill, pretty much all of or most of South Australia's major copper projects and all the IOCGs are within these structural corridors. And I noticed that there was contention between researchers about whether these lineaments were really used. But when you really got down to the bottom of it and dug deep into the history, you could see that these were instrumental in discovery, and people had forgotten about them and weren't using them so much in modern days to build ideas for where there might be significant fluid flow and mantle plumes coming up to result in high grade, large scale mineralization. And so I basically pegged a couple of projects in South Australia on the edge of the Gawler Craton, so on the eastern margin of the Gawler Craton. It was the Flinders project and the Torrens project. They're quite large projects. They've got copper mineralization at surface. They're about 60, 70 Ks from Carrapateena, IOCG, which is Oz Minerals, and they're about 160 Ks from Olympic Dam. But if you were to draw a straight line through Olympic Dam, through Carrapateena, you land in the middle of our 2 projects, Torrens and Flinders. And what was exciting to me about Flinders project, which was really the flagship project that we entered into the deal with Taruga, Strikeline Taruga deal in the beginning, was that it wasn't just that there was copper mineralization at the surface. So I read all the old paper reports dating back to the 1800s, where copper mining first started at a mine called Warrakimbo Mine, the Flinders project. And when I looked at the run of mine grade that was being mined there, they were mining at average 20% copper. But it wasn't just the copper grade that was interesting. There was notes of anomalous gold and silver, which hadn't been understood, potential for rare earth elements. And all the copper was was basically mineralized in this hematite breccia, which is very high grade, high purity hematite. And really there's, only a range of environments in which you get these things coming together. And, it's in many ways a typical IOCG style mineralization. Many people had never believed that it's possible to have IOCG mineralization in South Australia in the younger rocks of the Adelaide geosyncline, which is where the Flinders project is. The older rocks of the Gawler Craton are sitting underneath that, and we're on the edge of that margin. So we've got younger rocks with IOCG style mineralization sitting over the top, which are about 1 billion years younger almost than where Carrapateena and Olympic Dam are, but they're the exact same rocks which overlie Olympic Dam and Carrapateena. So, when I started looking at the geochemistry and reading and compiling all the historical work, started to build a picture here that all the historical explorers who had looked at these copper expressions on the surface had considered each of them in isolation from one another. No one had ever come in with a systems thinking mentality and considered the possibility that these might be linked to a deeper source beneath the surface. And one, I suppose, good way of explaining it, the way that we envisage this is you imagine a flower in bloom and you see petals at the surface, and those petals lead down to a bud and a stem. We're really looking for the bud and the stem, and we're using the petals that are expressed at the surface as our way of tracking. And so we set out, I set out to find out, are there ways we can link these things together? And how do we do that? So we use geophysics, which can image the subsurface. We use geochemistry. And the first thing we did was the geochem. We started doing rock chip sampling and soil sampling of the various copper mineralization over 15 k's of strike at Flinders. And what we could see is that all of the hematite or magnetite alteration with the copper, gold, and silver had a very unique, similar geochemical signature, which is, a typical kind of IOCG signature. That is highly anomalous in light rare earth elements, anomalous in copper, gold, and silver compared to barren iron oxides, and the presence of intense magnetite or hematite alteration. So it really struck me as something that has been overlooked and something that really needed to be investigated. And so that's how we set out to do it. And the next thing we did was do some large scale gravity surveys over the project area, because often, IOCG style mineralization, you get really dense bodies associated with it. Hematite and magnetite are quite dense. And so what you want to see in a gravity survey is a dense body. And what we identified was where we're getting the high grade copper, gold, and silver mineralization at the surface, there are high intensity, often pipe-like gravity and magnetic anomalies sitting directly underneath those expressions on the surface. And if you look at something like Carrapateena is a pipe-like ore body, pipe-like breccia system. So, you start putting the pieces together. We've got a hematite, magnetite, altered breccia exposed at the surface, which is mineralized with copper, gold, silver, rare earth elements, and other high field strength elements, indicating hydrothermal alteration. And we've got pipe-like, high-intensity magnetic and gravity anomalies sitting beneath it. And then we're doing soil sampling, and we're seeing big, high-order copper soil anomalies over the top. So for greenfields exploration, you can't really line a target up better than that. When you put those layers on top of each other and everything stacks up, the next thing to do is to go and drill. And so that's basically where we're at with Flinders project, and we're hoping to get back there and start drilling soon.
When I started looking into South Australia Gawler Craton a while ago, and I suddenly came to, sort of the picture is that it's very well mineralized, because like as you said, it's a well-known area for the Olympic dams and all that kind of things, and very complex and IOCG, but it's very still, correct me if I'm wrong, fairly underexplored or understood in terms of what you can get, and also the mix, the suite of metals that is potentially there is very different from the others. Maybe more inclined like the sort of Cloncurry, Mount Isa kind of suite of elements, as opposed to the goldfields, Kalgoorlie kind of stuff. Is that comment valid, in your opinion? Obviously, you've looked at it. Maybe you could sort of give your thoughts on that, on what I've just said.
Yeah, sure. Well, there are believed to be some significant mineralizing magmatic events that occurred around the Gawler Craton around 1593 million years. And there's a you know, a very common thread of that age that's happening there, which indicates there's some serious mantle pluming going on at that time and mineralizing, you know, creating large-scale mineralization. That was very specific to this particular area, and we believe it to be associated with that G2 structural corridor. So that's my daughter. Sorry. So that's probably the reason we get a unique setting in the Gawler Craton. Cloncurry and its IOCGs have a similar age to the Gawler IOCGs, and in some cases have similar geochems, but they're probably more diverse in their geochemistry than the Gawler IOCGs.
Yeah. I guess, you know, like I've noticed your results recently. You mentioned, you know, what your suite of elements that you got there, and I will say, you know, I'm one of those guys who looked at it and go, okay, that's fantastic. Those numbers are great, but what does it actually mean? And we had this discussion when prior to having this interview. You know, maybe just give us a good sort of geology 101 on what we're looking at and what all those numbers mean and what the elements mean.
Sure. So I should say that, you know, our projects are diverse, and our South Australian projects aren't all within the Gawler Craton. So Mount Craig project, which is where we've had the high grade sediment copper hits at Waiaka. You know, we had 11 meters at 1.5% copper, and we've hit copper up to 9.5% copper there at Waiaka at the north end of Mount Craig project. That's within the Adelaide geosyncline. It's still in the G2 structural corridor and that same lineament that Olympic Dam and Carapatina are on, but it's not on the edge of the Gawler Craton. It's actually further east from that in younger rocks without, and we don't know how deep the basement is beneath that. But the geochemistry in the rocks where we're exploring is very diverse, as you said, and, you know, we're primarily focused on copper, right? We love copper. We think it's got a really bright future. It's going to be used in so many applications moving forward. And of course, the electric vehicles is one of those. But we pegged this ground because it's structurally complex, geologically complex, and we've known from the beginning that our ground has potential for a range of styles of mineralization and a range of different metals to be mineralized there due to its complexity. And so when we go and drill, we always keep an open mind. And that's exactly what we did at Morgan's Creek. And, you know, those rare earth element results that we've had there recently, they're not by accident. You know, we're exploring primarily for copper, but we test for a broad suite of elements when we go in and drill a greenfields target. Because if we've got the world's biggest rare earth element deposit, we want to know about it. You know, if we've got the world's biggest gold deposit, we want to know about that too. We're not going to put our blinkers on and only test for copper and base metals because that's our primary target. And, you know, when the geochemistry comes back in, we check every element as if it has the potential to be an ore body. And that's what we did this time. And what we can see at Morgan's Creek, it just proves that, you know, Mount Craig project alone, that large breccia system there, these breccias at Mount Craig are different to the breccias at Flinders project and Torrens project. But the breccias at Mount Craig, they strike for 34 kilometers continuously along a major structure called the Warumba anticline. And if I could just step back and go into what the Warumba anticline is and why it's so complicated, why there are so many different metals there. Basically, we had an ancient inland sea in South Australia 700 million years ago, and the crust was spreading. And as the crust spreads inside the continent, so not out in the oceans, it's kind of in the continent, so we call it intracontinental rifting. The crust is spreading, it's thinning, and as it thins, it depresses and water flows in there and you form a sea. Now, a rift can often lead to a split in the crust, or it may be a failed rift. And in this case, it was a failed rift. So we had compression and expansion. The sea was getting deeper and shallower, and a bunch of different types of sediments were deposited depending on whether it was a deep marine or a shallow marine environment. Those sediments are enriched in base metals and other metals which were eroding off the older Gawler rocks. Now, the major structure which runs through the middle has much older rocks were sitting underneath that, and often what you get is along these major structures is the older rocks will erupt up in what we call a diaperic breccia through the major structure and intrude the younger rocks. And with that, they've got a lot of fluids that come up with them. In this case, there are a lot of mafic volcanics, a wide range of different types of volcanics. which were highly anomalous in a range of different metals. And as we know now, very anomalous in rare earths and other heavy metals, such as scandium, vanadium, battery metals, as lithium there. So these rocks have intruded the younger rocks overlying, and there's been a lot of fluids moving, a lot of chemical reactions which have occurred, and obviously dumped out high concentrations of different elements. And so that's one of the reasons we've approached exploration at Mount Craig project with an open mind. We've always known there's potential there for a wide range of different things. And now we know that it's not just copper, silver, and gold. And when we know the zinc potential there, we've got bullseye zinc anomalies at Mount Craig project, which are 9 square kilometers that no one's ever drilled. We haven't even looked at that yet. It's such a big system. It's such a big project. People find it hard to understand the scale when they look at it. It was initially 350 square kilometers. We've probably doubled that now. So, it's 700 square kilometer project, and we own the whole thing. Normally companies would share a piece of a project like this. There might be 3 or 4 different companies, but we've been lucky in that the ideas that we've had about where the potential is for mineralization, we've had these ideas in isolation of other people. So we've been able to peg ground that we really believed in, and we haven't had to fight other people for it. We've been able to peg the whole thing. So we're not getting little bits and pieces around someone else's discovery. We're pegging whole systems, and the idea is if we get onto something in any of them, we own the whole strike extent. And that's what we continue to do, and how we go about acquiring ground in South Australia and in other states.
I mean, when you talk about your copper intercepts, those numbers are very good in anyone's books. So how do you focus? I mean, what will be your next step? I mean, obviously, if you've got a lengthy intercept of, take your copper intercept for one, you can't ignore that, right? And as you mentioned, all the other aspects of it. So how would you focus? How would you go forward from here in that sense?
So we do have big projects and lots of targets, right? And that's a good problem to have. That's where you want to be as a greenfields company. And you want to be testing as many targets as you can while not spreading yourself too thin. We've obviously been good in our target prioritization. We've drilled 2 prospects at Mount Craig project. We hit high-grade copper in the first one. We've hit rare earth element discovery in the second one. Small meters, cheap drilling. We're obviously picking the right locations. And how we basically prioritize those targets is 1, ease of access, 2, mineralization at the surface, 3, geophysical anomalies, and 4, structural complexity. And when we put all those pieces together, we rank the targets and we go out and drill. Waiaka was first. There are 15, 20 historical surface copper mines there that were started in the 1800s. When you get that much smoke on the surface, you know there's potential. And there'd been some drilling at Waiaka before. No one had ever hit the grades that we hit before. They didn't quite understand what was going on there, and they were targeting just the stratigraphic horizon and not structures. But even then, a lot of the drilling fell short of intercepting the stratigraphic target. So at Waiaka, for example, there's one particular rock unit we call the Tyndalpina Shale, and that's got the perfect geochemistry and porosity for copper, sediment-hosted copper mineralization. It's exposed at the surface in a Gossan where all the historical mining was conducted, and in there is malachite, chalcopyrite, bornite. You can see it at the surface, and they sunk shafts and things into it, and they basically stopped when they got to water and couldn't dig by hand anymore. But the best drill intercepts that had been reported there historically were only 0.5% kind of thin copper. We took a look at it and thought, this can't be it. The geophysics is indicating some large IP anomalies and VTEM anomalies here, and there's too much smoke. So we went in and conduct our first pass program and target the down dip extents of this stratigraphic horizon, the Tyndalpina Shale, and we hit the high-grade copper at the base of it. But what we've learned about Waiaka is it is structurally complex, and there are 2 controls on mineralization there. One is stratigraphic control. The mineralization is contained within specific rock units. And then there's structural control. And the high-grade copper mineralization and the thickness of that mineralization appears to be heavily influenced by structures. And so with these learnings now, we apply that to our reconnaissance exploration moving forward so we can advance and conduct precision drilling using that information. So for example, at the moment, the team is out there. We've got a dedicated team at Waiaka who are doing structural mapping, soil sampling grids over the whole area with all these new structures that we've identified, which we believe are controlling mineralization. We're going to do some higher resolution gravity surveys to map these structures. And from that, we start to prioritize again new targets where we think the largest traps are for high-grade mineralization. At Waiaka, we've got 58 kilometers of strike of the Tyndalpina Shale. So it wraps around both sides of the anticline. And we've only really drilled about a kilometer of that strike. So there are a lot of structures there. There's a lot of Tyndalpina Shale, and there's a lot of opportunity there for large traps to host this copper mineralization. And now it just goes about prioritizing where to put the next holes.
In terms of infrastructure, we're talking about, I should ask the question, are we talking about it's hard to get there, or you got sort of bitumen roads all the way to your prospects?
Yeah, sure. Well, we're actually in a really good position. I say this area has been overlooked, and it really has. And one of the key things that attracted to me from the beginning was not just the mineralization that was obviously there, but the fact that there are gazetted roads, running around and through most of our project areas. So access is very easy. There are council maintained roads which are graded for us, every week. Local workforce is easily accessible. There are 2 regional centres right near our project areas where we source local workers from and contractors. We've got drilling contractors, only 50 k's away in the nearest town. We've got engineering services. There's substations, gas pipelines, rail lines running through some of our project areas. So, we have a really good position here where, if major discoveries are made, the pathway to development is so much easier than if you're in the Musgraves, for example. This is not uncharted territory. It's underexplored, but it's near civilization. And you look at something like Julimar discovery in WA, and people were shocked that there was a major discovery 80 k's out of Perth near infrastructure. But these things happen. People get ideas about that limit the way in which they go about exploration, and they close off based on those limited ideas. And it takes innovative new approach to come in and see that there's significant potential. Where this existing infrastructure is, where big discoveries are yet to be made.
Yeah, I think look, South Australia is one of those funny things. You until you look at the maps and where the roads are, you'd be surprised there's actually a lot more roads than you would think, and which makes all this exploration a lot simpler in that sense. One of the things, I guess, when you speak from an investor point of view, and people hear porphyries or they hear IOCGs, they get really worried that, hey, this is very expensive. This is not for small players. How do you give them comfort in what you guys have got?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. And what sets us apart from other IOCG explorers, if we just go back to Flinders Project and Torrens Project, we have IOCG style mineralization outcropping at surface. We can pick it up, we can sample it, we can send it off to the lab, we can do thin sections, we can study it. We're not drilling conceptual geophysical targets, which is 500 meters beneath the surface undercover, where you're just hoping, that when you drill your $500,000 diamond hole, that you're going to intercept some anomalism or some hematite or magnetite alteration that appears to be of IOCG style. We don't have that issue. We've got cheap, shallow drilling to test these targets, which are outcropping at surface. We don't need to be too conceptual in the way in which we go about these things. We're lucky in that they have the geophysical anomalies to back them up. We don't have to guess about whether there's mineralization there or not. We already know there is. So we're very different. There really is no other IOCG explorer in South Australia who has the scenario that we have. Everyone else, is testing through very deep cover, and they really don't know what they're going to intercept when they drill a hole. And most those drill holes fail. Most of them fail.
I guess the obvious questions from again from an investor point of view is what are your obstacles? What's that thorn in your behind and things like that. What's there to be that is of concern that you know of?
So one of the challenges that we have in South Australia in the area where we are exploring is land access in regards to native title and Aboriginal heritage. And the reason that's a challenge at the moment is because there's a lot of development happening in the space from a governance perspective when it comes to Aboriginal corporations. And there are a lot of corporations who are going into administration or are currently in administration that have other issues that they're dealing with that that are not related to mining and exploration, and a lot of those issues need to be addressed and are taking prioritization over the general running of business and the completion of native title mining agreements and land access and heritage surveys and things like that. So that has caused some delays in some areas, and it has extended the time through which access to the native title portions of our exploration projects has been possible. Our exploration projects are made up of native title land and non-native title land, and the native title land makes up probably less than 40% of our projects. We have really strong targets outside of native title land where we have been drilling, and we have really strong targets inside of native title land where we would like to get to. So ultimately, our discussions and our negotiations on our native title agreements in the area, we already hold one. There are a couple of different groups who have interest in the area, which has posed an additional challenge, because you're not just dealing with one Aboriginal group who have an interest in the area. So some areas might have 2 or 3 separate groups who might have multiple priorities going on and things they're dealing with from a governance perspective within their own organisations, which and they may not all agree on certain things about what's what. And so it does add a layer of complexity, social, political complexity, and it takes a lot of time to build those relationships and to build trust and to just work through these things. And we're really advancing positively in that space at the moment, and making some big developments. So I mean, we've got at the moment a 25% representation on our exploration team of local Aboriginal representation in our full-time employed staff, and we've actively been working with Aboriginal businesses in the area since we started exploration, and we really want to continue that and build on that.
A lot of people, when they talk about ESG these days, and they think it's a hurdle that we as an industry has sort of vastly ignored, but we've actually been towing the line of ESG, ever since I've been working in this industry 30 years ago. So ESG's come on, and everyone goes, oh, it's a big deal, but 25% representation, that's, I think a lot of people would probably be very surprised that that's what we have been doing for as long as I've been in this industry, is to keep in place this ESG. People would joke about how, when I said I was a geologist, or when I was studying, there used to be jokes about how I'm going to go and mow down all the trees, and but yeah, it's what's your hearing? Obviously, ESG component is a big conversation these days. So what are you hearing that's out there?
ESG is, you're right, it's been around for a long time, but it's never been more important than it is now, and it's never been more in the limelight than it is now. It's very important to me personally, and I think it's important to a lot of people, and it's becoming important to more and more important to shareholders, particularly as an organization becomes more mature and gets larger. It is really the future of mining and exploration, and what people need to understand now is that the real positive change that can happen in this space, the forefront of bridging the gap and the forefront of positive developments that can happen in this space, to me, is mining and exploration. That's where everything is coming to a head, and it's the place where the best work is being done. And it's also the place where companies get the worst rap. So bad news travels fast. We've all heard, negative news stories with resources companies and situations relating to Aboriginal heritage over recent times. Bad news travels fast, but good news travels very, very slowly. And there are a lot of companies out there doing good things, and it doesn't really get noticed. But I think this is where we're going to see the change, and people need to invest more time into the exploration and mining space, and those collaborations need to continue to develop. And I'm seeing that happening. I feel like there's never been a time before where so much change is happening in this space. So it's a really amazing, and an interesting time to be in mineral exploration, particularly in a place like South Australia, but Australia-wide. It's not just WA, it's not just South Australia. This is happening across the country. And I think it's a really positive thing. And really, it's about involving local Aboriginal stakeholders more in the process of exploration, and more in decision-making process about how exploration is conducted on traditional lands. Because we also need to remember that, native title is a boundary that has been put in place, but it wasn't a boundary that was there pre-colonization. So native title land is not the only land that is important to Aboriginal people. All land is important to Aboriginal people. And so this is another thing that needs to be understood that has been overlooked quite a lot. Aboriginal people need to be engaged in non-native title land and native title land. And that can become quite complicated, because who do you talk to when it's not clear who is responsible culturally for the land?
I think that's a very, very good point. Is that I remember talking to a guy called, from the Fish Foundation. He talks about how, to understand the past, well, to move forward, you need to understand the past. And there's a level playing field that needs to be got to to move forward, And going back to my comment about knocking down trees, I had a discussion with one of the participants in the industry. He said, look, knocking down a tree means creating a great big hole. If you put your drill hole next to it and the hole blows out, you create more issues for yourself. It's probably easier to move your drill hole 10, 20 meters away from there. And let's face it, if 10 to 20 meters means missing the deposit, I think you better find a new project,
That's exactly what we say. We think if we're going to move the whole 10 meters and we miss the target because of that, then it's not a target worth drilling. It's true.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, look, Taruga is very interesting. Look, I when I looked at it, as I said to you, I looked at it, probably a year and a half ago, and it was a very, very interesting project. But I think what you guys have done ever since, the new projects, makes it even more interesting for me in the sense of the story, where it can be. And there's a lot of to sum it all up, I guess, for you to talk to, say, your existing shareholders or someone who's potentially looking at this now, because Samso is so prevalent. But what, because your last analysis had a lot of good points there that gets a bit lost, because there's a misunderstanding or on a hard to understand concept of what you have. If you could, in a summarized version, a pitch to those people we just mentioned, how do you explain that last bit of your story?
Sure, yeah. Well, we're streamlined and focused primarily on copper and base metals, but our mineralization styles that we're targeting are quite diverse. And we have, that's why we've got multiple areas that we've pegged, and that's why we're exploring different targets. In Western Australia, we've got some VMS targets in the Manjimup project, and we've got some nickel massive sulfide targets which adjoin the Chalice mines and Venture Minerals ground nearby the Odin and Thor targets in the southwest terrain. And we've obviously got IOCG targets which can host a wide range of metals, but we've also got the base metal sediment hosted copper targets, and now we're seeing rare earth element mineralization coming into play as well. So really we're looking at polymetallic with a copper focus. And the reason polymetallic is exciting and why we target it is because you have different cycles in the markets, and if you've got multiple commodities within your deposit, then you are in some ways cushioned against the variations and fluctuations of a particular metal which might not be performing well. We feel like the strength of copper is going to continue to be strong and only going to get stronger over the long-term trend. So that's why it's a core focus, and most of our ground is focused around that. But we know there is huge potential in the type of ground that we peg for other metals as well. And we are going to explore those. And if they're there, we're going to find them. And we're going to create value for our shareholders out of whatever mineralization is present in our ground. And due to its complexity, we expect to see some surprises in the different styles of mineralization, as we did earlier this week at Morgan's Creek, that might be possible there. All of these things that we're finding are relevant to the future electric vehicles, battery minerals, and they really are in the exact same streamlined focus of the materials that are required for the technological future that we all know we're moving toward. So whether it be copper, whether it be zinc, nickel, vanadium for batteries, rare earth elements used in various technologies, all those things are in the same kind of line of thought, and we know that our ground has potential for all of them.
Yeah, Well, the number one thing I get out of that is that the thought I had was you got a project where everything seems to be mineralizing. So one big cooking pot, it's a good mixture. And when you got so many things that's cooking, it's probably the best place to be in some ways. That's why I was quite amazed at the range going from the northern part of your tenement right down to the southern part, is that you get this everything seems to be kicking, and they may not be like fanciful grades, but the fact that you're getting those grades. I mean, copper, the grade that you copper, if you that's a mine grade, you'd be jumping up and down. But the fact that everything's cooking at the same time, it's more than interesting for me in that sense. But look, Thomas, it's fantastic, great. I hope we can continue to follow your journey, and thanks for the time. But I do look again, as always. I try and get you guys to go out and ask the questions, because you've got to get those information from the horse's mouth, and none best than the guy that's put the project in, and you can see that he's driving it, so he's sort of putting his money where his mouth is. And I think it's a really, really interesting project. I'm glad that I was asked to have a look at it, and I think now we're at this point where we're having a chat. It's really great. So Thomas, thank you, and let's hopefully we'll keep up with what you've been doing.
Thanks, Noel. Really appreciate it, and look forward to catching up again soon.